The small village lay at the edge of the barren plain, forgotten by generals and rulers, a place where life moved slowly and no one expected greatness to rise, yet within its narrow streets and dusty fields lived a woman named Liana, a figure so ordinary that people rarely noticed her beyond the tasks she performed each day, and if they did, they spoke only of her patience, her kindness, and the quiet way she cared for her aging father and the few animals she tended, but what none of them realized was that the silence of her life was not born of weakness or ignorance. It was the silence of someone who watched, who learned, who carried within her a strength that needed no witness, a strength that would one day shake the assumptions of men who had sworn with their uniforms, medals, and command that something was impossible, yet that day had not arrived, and so she continued her life, rising with the first light to fetch water from the river, kneading bread with her calloused hands, humming softly as she wove baskets to sell in the market, all while soldiers marched past the village on their way to the hills, for war had come to the land and the colonel who led them believed victory could be taken by force and fear alone, never considering that an unremarkable woman could teach him otherwise. But as the weeks passed, trouble grew, for the enemy had entrenched themselves beyond the valley, their weapons positioned where the colonel's artillery could not reach, and every attempt to move forward ended in blood and retreat, until his officers whispered in his tent that the campaign was doomed, and villagers whispered by their fires that the soldiers would abandon them, leaving them to the wrath of those who waited across the plain. Yet through all this, Liana listened, not with the ears of a soldier but with the patience of someone who understood the land, its rivers, its hidden paths, the way the winds shifted in the evening, and she remembered stories her grandfather had told of secret routes through the gorge, routes dismissed as myths by men who trusted maps more than memory, and though she had no rank, no weapon, no authority, she carried in her mind a key to survival, a possibility that the colonel and his trained men could not see, for their pride blinded them to wisdom that came without uniform. And so when the chance arrived, when a messenger came limping into the village begging for help because the regiment had been cut off from supplies and morale was breaking, she stepped forward, her voice steady though her heart pounded, offering knowledge of a passage that could outflank the enemy and deliver the army to safety. But the soldiers laughed, dismissing her words as foolish, insisting no such path existed, while the colonel, wearied by defeat and humiliation, fixed his stern eyes upon her, his patience thin, demanding to know why he should believe a simple woman when his best scouts had found nothing. And Liana, standing small before the banners of war and the cold gleam of steel, answered not with pride but with certainty, describing every twist of the gorge, the sound of water echoing in its hidden chambers, the scent of wild thyme that grew along its stones, details no liar could invent. And for the first time, doubt flickered across the colonel's hardened face, for though he had commanded men for decades, he could not dismiss the clarity of her words, and so, half out of desperation and half from a strange instinct he could not name, he agreed to test her claim. And in that moment the fate of hundreds turned upon the unshaken voice of a woman the world thought insignificant, for what they had declared impossible now balanced upon her will, and she knew she could not falter, not with the eyes of the colonel upon her and the weight of lives pressing like a storm against her quiet shoulders. The march began under the cover of night, when the stars shone pale and the moon hid behind shifting clouds, and though the colonel gave the order, it was Liana who walked at the front, her bare feet soundless on the rocky soil, guiding men who carried rifles, cannons, and the heavy pride of an army that had failed too many times before, their faces marked with doubt and hunger, yet compelled to follow because their commander had decided to trust the unbelievable. And as they moved, whispers spread among the ranks, some mocking, some fearful, that their fate was now in the hands of a village woman. But Liana heard none of it, her mind fixed on the terrain she knew by heart, the faint curve of the land where reeds grew taller, the subtle rise that told of stone beneath, the scent of damp air promising that the gorge lay ahead. And though the colonel kept close, watching her every move with suspicion, he too began to sense that she carried certainty with each step, a certainty his maps and scouts had never given him. And as dawn threatened to break, she led them to a fissure in the hills, narrow and choked with thorn bushes, so unremarkable that any trained eye might dismiss it as nothing more than a crack in the earth. But when she pushed aside the branches and slipped through, the soldiers saw a hidden passage open before them, a tunnel of stone carved by water long ago, cool and echoing, wide enough for men to pass in single file. And though fear flickered in their eyes at the thought of walking into the dark, her calm voice assured them that this path was safe, that it would bring them behind the enemy lines where no guard stood. And reluctantly, the colonel ordered them forward, his own heart wrestling between the pride of command and the strange humility of following where a simple woman led. And step by step they entered the gorge, the sound of boots and equipment swallowed by stone walls, the air growing heavy with silence, Yet Liana never faltered, her memory guiding her through each turn, each bend where the rocks grew slick with moss, each ledge where one misstep could send a soldier plunging into unseen depths. And as hours passed and the men grew restless, she carried them onward with her steady pace, until even the colonel, hardened by battles, found himself struck by the truth that she had not exaggerated, that her knowledge was no fantasy, for the gorge twisted exactly as she described, the walls bearing the marks she had foretold, and when at last the sun fell again and they emerged on the far side, the army stood upon high ground behind the enemy camp, their foes unaware, their fortifications facing the wrong direction, vulnerable in ways the colonel had never dared dream, and for a long moment silence held the men, awe mingled with disbelief, as they looked from the enemy to the woman who had brought them here, realizing that what their generals had sworn impossible had been made real by someone they had overlooked, and the colonel himself, standing tall yet shaken, turned to her with an expression that no one had ever seen on his face, a mixture of respect and unease, for though victory was now within reach, it had come not from strategy or force but from trust in someone who had no place in their ranks. And as the soldiers prepared their weapons, as orders were whispered and blades sharpened, Liana stood apart, not craving glory, not seeking reward, only holding the quiet conviction that she had done what was needed, that she had carried them through the impossible, and whether they remembered her name or not, the truth could not be undone, for the colonel had seen with his own eyes that the strength of a simple woman could achieve what armies could not, and though the battle had yet to be fought, she had already proved them wrong. The campfire light flickered across weary faces as the soldiers settled into their hidden position, and though exhaustion tugged at their bodies, a strange energy burned among them, the knowledge that they had crossed the uncrossable and now stood where no scout had dared to claim. Yet with this energy came fear, for to strike from behind was bold but to fail would mean annihilation, and so the colonel paced along the ridge, his sharp eyes scanning the valley below where the enemy fires glowed, lines of tents and watchtowers facing the opposite side of the plain, utterly blind to the danger looming above them, and while his officers whispered strategies, debating whether to attack before dawn or wait until the enemy grew complacent, the colonel's gaze often strayed to Liana, who sat quietly near the rocks, her hands clasped as though she prayed not to gods or spirits but for strength within herself. For though she had led them here, she knew the burden had only begun, because the colonel would not allow her to vanish back into obscurity now. He would test her again, weigh her judgment, measure whether her courage was more than a single act of guidance, and she felt the weight of his suspicion, the question in his eyes of whether her usefulness was spent or just awakening, and when he approached her, his boots crunching against the gravel, the camp hushed, for even the soldiers sensed that something unseen was unfolding, and he asked in a voice low but heavy whether she believed they could win if they struck at dawn, and Liana lifted her eyes to his, steady though shadows pooled around them, answering not with the fear of one speaking to power but with the calm truth of someone who saw the land as clearly as a map, explaining how the enemy, weary from their assumption of safety, would stumble in panic if attacked from behind, how the gorge itself would cut off their retreat if blocked quickly, and how the high ground gave them a vantage no opposing force could counter. And her words were so direct, so unadorned, that the colonel found himself silenced, as though he were the pupil and she the teacher, though pride fought within him to deny it. And yet deep inside he knew her clarity was truer than the arguments of his seasoned men, so he ordered the army to prepare for dawn, not admitting to anyone, not even himself, that her counsel guided his choice. And as the night dragged on with the sharpening of blades and the low murmur of soldiers readying themselves, Liana sat awake, her mind restless, not out of fear of death but from the strangeness of what she had become, no longer invisible, no longer just the daughter of a farmer, but the bearer of responsibility for lives she had never asked to command. And when the first light of morning bled across the sky, painting the valley in hues of silver and fire, the colonel raised his hand and the attack began. The soldiers surging down from the ridge with the roar of thunder, their rifles cracking, their banners unfurling, and the enemy, struck from a direction they believed secure, broke in confusion, scrambling to form lines that collapsed as quickly as they rose, and within minutes the battlefield was chaos, the colonel bellowing orders, his officers pressing the advantage, and yet amid it all, eyes still turned to the woman who had led them here, as if her presence itself lent strength to their charge. And when victory seemed certain, when the enemy scattered in retreat and the ground shook with the stampede of their flight, the colonel stood tall upon the ridge, his chest swelling with pride, but deep within he knew the truth, that his triumph had been delivered not by his strategies but by the one person no man had believed, the one who now stood quietly among the smoke and shouts, unarmed, uncelebrated, but undeniable, for before his very eyes she had achieved what his medals ranks and years of command had failed to accomplish, and though he would not admit it aloud, his heart whispered the truth that the impossible had been made real by the hands of a simple woman. The battle ended with the valley littered in smoke and silence, the cries of the wounded fading into the distance as the sun climbed higher, and though the soldiers cheered their triumph, raising their rifles in the air and shouting the colonel's name, Liana stood apart, her eyes scanning the broken landscape with neither joy nor sorrow, only the heavy awareness that victory always bore a price. For among the fallen she saw not only the enemy but boys from the village, men whose laughter she had once heard by the river, now silent forever, and her heart ached though she showed nothing, while the colonel basked in the glory of his success, walking among his men clasping shoulders, giving orders with a booming voice that echoed against the stone cliffs. But even as he reveled, his thoughts returned to the woman who had brought them here, and he could not escape the uneasy truth that without her they would have been slaughtered, and so when the dust began to settle he summoned her, his tone outwardly commanding but carrying a thread of uncertainty, as if he wrestled with the unfamiliar act of addressing her not as a villager but as an equal voice in matters of war, and she approached, her hands folded, her gaze unshaken, waiting for his words, and he asked what she saw, what her eyes told her about the enemy's next move, because though he would not confess it, he trusted her sight more than that of his scouts, and she answered in her calm, unadorned way, speaking of how the enemy, though broken, was not destroyed, that they would regroup in the forested hills beyond the river, that their pride would not allow them to accept defeat without striking again, and that the army must move swiftly if it hoped to end the war before it stretched into years of blood. And the colonel listened, his officers glancing uneasily at one another, reluctant to hear strategy from a woman yet unable to deny the ring of truth in her words, and finally he nodded, ordering preparations to march, though the decision burned his pride like fire, for every command he gave now carried her shadow, and Liana felt the weight of this strange bond forming, a bond not of choice but of necessity, for he could not let her go and she could not walk away while the land bled, and so she followed as the army gathered itself, carrying no weapon but her memory, no rank but the quiet authority of someone who had already proved impossible things, and in the nights that followed, as they crossed rivers and trudged through forests, she endured the stares of soldiers who whispered about her, some with awe, some with bitterness, wondering why their colonel allowed a common woman to shape their fate, yet she ignored them all, her focus on the land, her senses alive to its signs, the rustle of leaves that warned of scouts nearby, the tracks in the mud that spoke of enemy movements, the shift of the wind that foretold storms, and each time she spoke, the colonel listened, and each time her words proved true, until even the doubters among the ranks began to fall silent, for results silenced mockery better than any command, and slowly the legend of her guidance grew, whispered in campfires, carried from one company to another, until she was no longer just Liana of the village, but the woman who saw what others could not, the woman who had led them to victory. When defeat had seemed certain, and though she cared little for titles or tales, the truth pressed on her from all sides, that she had stepped into a path that could never be undone, and while the colonel claimed the victories aloud, taking the praise of generals and the loyalty of his men, he could not shake the knowledge, deep and unyielding, that each success bore the imprint of her unseen hand, and as he looked at her across the campfires, her simple dress stained with dust, her hair loose from the wind, he felt something stir that he could not name, something like fear, something like respect, for she had broken the order of things simply by being herself, and in his eyes burned the unspoken realization that the world would never be the same now that she had proved what men had sworn could not be done. The march into the hills tested them harder than any battlefield had, for the land itself became an enemy, with storms that lashed against their tents, rivers that rose in sudden floods, and cliffs that forced them into dangerous climbs, yet through every hardship it was Liana who steadied them, not with commands or speeches but with the quiet assurance of someone who knew how to read the signs of earth and sky, pointing to a hollow where they could take shelter from the rain, leading them to a spring when their canteens ran dry, warning them of unstable ground before their wagons could topple, and though she never raised her voice, the soldiers began to look to her. Even before their officers, a shift the colonel could not ignore, for though he still walked with his usual authority, he saw in their eyes that her presence gave them something his medals never had, a belief that survival was possible, and it unsettled him, because command was the marrow of his life, yet here was a woman with no rank who carried it as naturally as breathing, and the more he resisted the thought, the stronger it grew, for each day her guidance proved them right and his doubts wrong, and when at last they reached the forested hills where the enemy had gathered, the army stood upon the edge of another impossible choice, for scouts returned with word that the enemy had built strongholds deep among the trees, using the terrain as a fortress, impossible to breach without devastating losses, and despair threatened to settle upon the men, but Liana stepped forward once more, her voice steady as she described the old charcoal paths the villagers once used generations ago. Hidden tracks through the forest that would allow the army to approach unseen, and again the officers bristled, muttering of superstition and women's tales, yet the colonel silenced them, his voice sharp, for though pride burned in him still, he had learned enough to know her words carried weight, and so the soldiers followed her once more, slipping into the forest like shadows, guided by her memory of paths long overgrown, and though the trees pressed in with darkness and strange cries echoed through the branches, she never faltered, her steps certain as if the earth itself whispered to her, until they came upon the enemy encampments, sprawling and confident, utterly unaware of the danger curling around them, and when the attack came it was swift and merciless, the enemy scattering in shock as flames rose among their tents, their weapons abandoned in panic, and victory rolled across the hills like thunder. Yet again the soldiers knew in their hearts that this triumph did not belong to their colonel but to the woman who had led them unseen through the forest, and though he shouted his commands, raised his sword, and carried the glory of the charge, he felt the weight of truth pressing heavier with each breath, that without her they were nothing, that she had made possible what no army could, and in the aftermath, when the enemy remnants fled into the mountains, leaving behind their strongholds and their wounded pride, the soldiers gathered around the fires not to speak of their colonel's brilliance but to whisper of Liana, their simple guide, their impossible savior, and though she tried to withdraw into silence, wishing for nothing but the return of her quiet life, she could not, for her name now carried farther than she could imagine, her story moving from one soldier's lips to another, until it reached even the ears of generals beyond the hills, and as the colonel sat alone in his tent, his heart torn between triumph and unease, he knew he stood at a crossroads, for he could continue to take her wisdom and claim it as his own, or he could face the truth before his men and before himself, that history was being rewritten by the hand of a woman who had no desire for history at all, and the thought filled him not only with dread but with a strange, reluctant reverence, for in her quiet defiance of the impossible she had become something he could neither control nor deny. The war might have ended there if not for the stubborn pride of those who had lost, for though their camps were destroyed and their numbers scattered, their leaders retreated into the mountains, forging alliances with other bands of fighters, and soon word came that they were gathering a final force, larger and more desperate than before, determined to strike back and reclaim their honor. And when the message reached the colonel's camp, unease spread like wildfire, for his army was tired, their supplies thin, their wounds not yet healed, and though victories had lifted their spirits, the thought of facing a force greater than any they had yet seen struck fear even into hardened soldiers. But it was not fear that haunted the colonel most, it was the knowledge that once again his men turned their eyes toward Liana, not to him, as if she alone could carry them through what seemed hopeless, and he could not decide whether to feel anger or gratitude, for every part of his being resisted the thought of bowing his command to her, yet every part of his reason told him she was the only reason they still stood, and so he summoned her, his voice rough with the weight of conflicted pride, asking what she saw in the days ahead, what she believed could be done when all paths seemed blocked, and she answered as she always did, not with hesitation but with clear, steady words, saying that if they fought the enemy in the open field they would surely be crushed, but if they lured them into the valley where the cliffs narrowed, where the river cut deep and fast, then their numbers would turn against them, their strength becoming their trap, for the valley could be sealed behind them with fire and stone, leaving them no escape, and though the colonel's officers scoffed, muttering that such a plan relied on chance and the impossible, the colonel silenced them once more, for in his heart he knew that chance had nothing to do with Liana's visions, that she saw the land as if it whispered to her, and he could no longer deny the strange certainty that surrounded her presence, so he agreed, and the army prepared, laying quiet traps along the valley, gathering logs and pitch to block the exits, positioning archers along the high cliffs, all under the guidance of the woman who had once been invisible to them. And when the day came, the enemy arrived in waves, a sea of armor and fury spilling into the narrow gorge, believing they had cornered a weak and fleeing force, but as their banners filled the valley and their shouts shook the air, the signal was given, and the trap was sprung, stones tumbling from above, fires roaring at the entrance, arrows hissing through the air like rain, and in moments the enemy's vast numbers became their doom, trapped in a cage of rock and flame, their charge collapsing into panic, and the colonel's army, though fewer and weary, fought with the ferocity of men who believed destiny itself stood on their side, and by nightfall the valley was silent, the last resistance crushed, the enemy broken beyond repair, and when the smoke cleared, the soldiers raised their voices not in the colonel's name but in the name of the woman who had seen what no one else could, their chants rising into the night until even the colonel stood frozen, hearing with his own ears how his men no longer looked to him as the source of their survival but to her, and though the sound struck his pride like a blade, he could not stop it, for he had seen with his own eyes what she had done, and in that moment he realized the truth that frightened him most, that history would remember him as a commander, but it would remember her as something greater, something that lived beyond medals or rank, and though she sought no glory, her name was already being etched into the hearts of those who had lived because she refused to believe in the impossible, and the colonel, hardened by years of command, felt something stir deep within him, not anger now, not jealousy, but the dawning reverence of a man who had finally seen greatness not in himself but in another, and it humbled him more than any defeat ever had. The days that followed the final battle were strange and heavy, for though victory had been secured and the enemy broken, the army did not feel the same triumph that usually followed such an end. Instead they felt a quiet reverence that lingered like a shadow over every campfire, for they knew in their hearts that their survival was not born of steel or command but from the guidance of the woman who had once been no more than a face among villagers, and now that she had led them through every impossible trial, the question grew among the men of what would become of her, whether she would remain with them or return to the simple life she had left behind, and whispers spread of statues that should be built, of songs that should be sung, though Liana herself wished for none of it, her heart aching only for the peace she once knew, to walk again by the river, to weave baskets in silence, to tend to her father without the roar of soldiers in her ears. Yet fate had no intention of granting her such quiet, for when the colonel summoned her to his tent, his face no longer hard with suspicion but softened with something like weariness, he told her that generals from the capital had sent word, demanding to know the truth of the victories, and though he might have claimed the glory for himself as most men would, he found he could not, for the memory of her standing before him, speaking with certainty where all his officers had failed, was carved into him too deeply, and to deny it would be to deny the very eyes with which he had seen. Yet to admit it would mean appending the world he knew, for armies did not bend to the wisdom of women, kingdoms did not raise commoners as saviors, and so he wrestled in silence, until finally he asked her what she wanted, not as a commander to a soldier but as a man to someone whose will had already changed his destiny, and she answered with no hesitation, saying she wanted nothing but to return to her home, to the life she had left behind, to the peace of her village, and the colonel looked at her as though she had spoken in another tongue, for he could not understand how one who had shaped the course of a war could ask for so little, and something inside him broke then, a piece of his pride crumbling as he realized her greatness lay not only in what she had done but in what she refused to take, and though part of him longed to persuade her, to keep her near, to bind her to the army as its unseen strength, he knew it would betray the very essence of what made her extraordinary, so he let her go, though the words caught like stones in his throat. And when she left the tent that night the soldiers watched in silence, some bowing their heads, some touching the hilts of their blades as if in salute, for they felt she carried with her something sacred, and though she walked with no armor, no banner, no escort, the weight of the army's reverence followed her like a tide, and as she disappeared into the darkness, the colonel stood at the edge of his camp, his heart torn with a strange mixture of loss and awe, knowing that he had witnessed what no man of his rank had ever imagined, that a simple woman had not only proved them wrong but had reshaped the meaning of strength itself, and in the quiet of that night he swore to himself that he would speak the truth when the generals demanded it, no matter what it cost his name, for it was better to live in the shadow of her light than to claim a false glory that belonged to her alone. And as the stars wheeled above, silent and eternal, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if even the heavens bowed to the truth that had unfolded before the colonel's eyes. When Liana returned to her village the fields were the same and the river still flowed with its quiet song, yet she was no longer the same woman who had once fetched water at dawn and woven baskets by firelight, for though her heart yearned for the simplicity she had left behind, her mind carried the weight of battlefields, of lives saved and lost, of choices made under the gaze of men who believed her powerless until she proved otherwise, and though her neighbors welcomed her with smiles and questions she gave them little, speaking only of the journey and not the glory, for she did not crave their awe, she craved only to vanish into the life she had once known. But destiny does not easily release those who have altered its course, and word of her deeds traveled faster than she could hide, carried by soldiers who had followed her, by officers who had witnessed the impossible, until her name reached the capital itself, where generals argued and nobles debated, some calling her a myth, others insisting she be brought forth to receive honor or to be silenced before her presence unraveled the order of things. And soon riders came to the village, bearing the colonel himself, who had kept his promise to speak the truth, though it had cost him the favor of his peers, for when questioned he had told them plainly that their victories belonged not to him but to the woman who now lived again among her sheep and fields, and though many sneered, mocking him for yielding glory to a commoner, others listened, troubled by the certainty in his words, and thus the kingdom found itself wrestling with the existence of one they could not fit into their rules, for a woman without rank should not have commanded destiny, yet she had, and no decree could erase it, and when the colonel arrived at her door, his armor dusty, his face lined not with command but with something softer, he told her of the turmoil she had stirred without meaning to, how some wished to crown her a heroine, how others whispered of punishment, and she looked at him with the same calm she had carried through storms and fire, saying she wanted none of it, that her only wish was to live quietly, and the colonel bowed his head, for he knew her words were truth, yet he also knew the world would never let her go entirely, for men would always tell the tale of the woman who had led an army where maps had failed, who had turned valleys into traps and forests into roads, who had shown that the impossible was only the blindness of those who refused to see, and though she returned to her life, tending her father, weaving her baskets, walking the river banks, she carried within her the knowledge that nothing ordinary remained, because the eyes of the world had once rested upon her and seen their salvation, and the colonel too carried her presence wherever he went, his commands forever tempered by the memory of her voice, by the realization that greatness does not come from medals or banners but from the courage to see what others cannot. And as years passed and songs were sung of battles and victories, her name wove itself into them, sometimes twisted, sometimes exalted, sometimes hidden, but always there, a thread unbreakable, for though she asked for no glory the truth had already been carved into stone. They had said it could not be done, and yet she had done it, and the colonel, who had once stood so certain of his own power, became the first to admit before his men and before himself that he had been wrong, that it was before his very eyes that a simple woman had proved the impossible false. And in that truth both his pride and his world were forever changed, and though Liana never sought recognition, never raised her voice to claim it, she lived on as a living reminder that strength is not bound by station or name, that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by those who seek them but by those who simply refuse to believe that the impossible is beyond reach. The end.